June 24th, 1945, Red Square, Moscow. The rain was torrential, beating down on the cobblestones like drum fire. But the millions of people watching, in the square, in the streets, huddled around radios across the ruined expanse of the Soviet Union, didn't care about the weather. They were watching a god of war. Riding out of the Spasskaya Tower on a magnificent, blindingly white Arabian stallion was Marshal Georgy Zhukov. He was the eagle of the Red Army. He was the man who had broken the back of the Nazi war machine at Stalingrad. He had shattered the blockade at Leningrad. He had driven his tanks over the bones of the Wehrmacht and personally accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich in the smoking ruins of Berlin. As his horse galloped across the wet stones, the cheer that erupted from the crowd was primal. It was deafening. They weren't cheering for the Communist Party. They weren't cheering for the political ideology that had starved them for 2 decades. They were cheering for him. High above the square, standing on the balcony of the Lenin Mausoleum, Joseph Stalin watched. His face was a frozen mask of pockmarked stone. He puffed slowly on his pipe. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the way the hardened combat veterans wept as Zhukov rode past. And in that exact moment, the air around the Soviet dictator grew freezing cold. Stalin turned slightly to Lavrenti Beria, the ruthless head of the NKVD, the secret police. "He rides well," Stalin murmured, his voice barely audible over the roaring crowd. Perhaps too well. That single, quiet sentence was a death warrant. Less than a year later, the white stallion was gone. The medals were stripped. The greatest military genius of the 20th century was shoved into the back of a black car in the dead of night, exiled to the forgotten corners of the empire. Stalin didn't just fire his best general. He attempted to surgically erase a hero from the memory of the human race. The anatomy of paranoia. To understand the visceral, bone-deep betrayal that destroyed Georgy Zhukov, you have to look at the world without illusions. You have to understand the absolute, suffocating terror that haunted the Kremlin after the guns fell silent in 1945. Totalitarian systems are machines built on a single currency: fear. Before the Second World War, Stalin had murdered 35,000 of his own military officers in the Great Purge. He did it because he knew that the only force on earth capable of removing him from power was a standing army led by a competent general. He preferred his army to be brain-dead rather than disloyal. But when Adolf Hitler kicked the door in on June 22, 1941, Stalin's brain-dead army was slaughtered. Millions were surrounded and captured. To save his own life, and to save the Soviet state from total annihilation, Stalin had been forced to do the one thing he swore he would never do. He had to give power back to the professionals. He had to let men like Zhukov think. He had to let them command. He had to let them win. But by the summer of 1945, the emergency was over. Stalin looked out at a Red Army that was 12 million men strong. These soldiers had marched from the Volga to the Spree. They knew how to fight. They knew how to win. And they worshipped Georgy Zhukov with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. "If Zhukov gives the order," Beria whispered to Stalin in the dark corridors of the Kremlin, "the army will march on Moscow. They will arrest the Politburo. They will arrest you." Stalin knew history. He knew the story of the French Revolution. He knew that after the chaos, the military always produces a Napoleon Bonaparte, a beloved general who steps in, clears out the politicians, and crowns himself emperor. Zhukov had to be destroyed, but he couldn't just be taken to the basement of the Lubyanka and shot. If Stalin executed the hero of the Soviet Union in 1946, the military might actually revolt. The assassination had to be character first, physical second. Stalin ordered the NKVD to unleash a masterpiece of psychological destruction, the salami tactics. The trap was set in early 1946. It didn't start with an arrest warrant. It started with a whisper campaign. The NKVD agents moved in the shadows, arresting Zhukov's subordinate officers. They dragged them into interrogation rooms. They beat them with rubber truncheons. They smashed their fingers and broke their ribs until the men screamed and signed fabricated confessions. The confessions all said the same thing. Marshal Zhukov is preparing a military coup. Marshal Zhukov believes he won the war alone. Then came the trophy affair. The NKVD raided Zhukov's Moscow apartment and his country dacha while he was away. They discovered a massive hoard of looted German goods, dozens of gold watches, miles of fine silk, rare antique furniture, silverware stolen from German castles. In reality, every single high-ranking officer in the Red Army had taken trophies from Germany. Stalin himself had authorized it. It was the unofficial, unspoken reward for surviving the bloodiest war in human history. But for Zhukov, it was framed as a moral crime. The NKVD compiled a massive dossier painting the hero of Berlin as a greedy, decadent, corrupt warlord who cared more about stolen carpets than the Soviet state. "Look at him," Stalin sneered, tossing the dossier onto his desk. "He acts like a czar." The execution room. The climax of this betrayal occurred in June 1946. Stalin called a closed-door session of the Supreme Military Council in the Kremlin. Zhukov walked into the room expecting a routine briefing. Instead, he walked into an execution. Stalin sat at the head of the heavy wooden table, puffing on his pipe, his eyes dead and flat. Standing in the corners of the room, blocking the doors, were NKVD guards, with their hands resting on their holsters. Seated around the table were the other marshals of the Soviet Union. These were the men Zhukov had bled with. Men like Ivan Konev and Konstantin Rokossovsky. Men who owed their lives and their victories to Zhukov's strategic genius. "Comrade Zhukov," Stalin began, his voice dangerously soft. "We have received disturbing reports." Stalin nodded to the NKVD representative, who began reading the fabricated confessions of Zhukov's tortured subordinates. The charges were devastating. Megalomania. Disrespecting the party. Claiming that the military, not Stalin, had defeated Nazi Germany. Zhukov's blood ran cold. He looked around the table at his friends. He expected them to stand up. He expected Rokossovsky, a man who had his own teeth knocked out by the NKVD years earlier, to defend him. Instead, one by one, the marshals broke eye contact. They stared at their polished boots. They stared at the wood grain of the table. And then, to save their own lives, they began to betray him. Konev stood up, his voice shaking slightly, and accused Zhukov of intolerable arrogance. Another general accused him of political unreliability. They fed him to the wolves because they knew if they didn't, the wolves would eat them next. Zhukov stood alone. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He slammed his heavy hands down on the table, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it would shatter. "I have served my country," Zhukov roared, his voice echoing in the silent, terrifying room. "I bled for this nation. My record speaks for itself." Stalin watched the performance with cold satisfaction. He had what he wanted. He had broken the myth of the untouchable hero. He had forced the military to eat their own leader. "You are relieved of command, Comrade Zhukov," Stalin said simply. The ghost with medals. Zhukov wasn't executed. Stalin chose a far more agonizing punishment: geographical and psychological erasure. He was stripped of his position as commander-in-chief of ground forces. He was banished from the capital and sent to command the Odessa military district, a minor coastal backwater hundreds of miles from the center of power. For the man who had commanded millions of troops and conquered the capital of the Third Reich, Odessa was a suffocating, humiliating joke. He was reduced to inspecting local barracks and chasing black market smugglers. But the physical exile wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. Zhukov was placed under 24-hour NKVD surveillance. Every phone call he made was recorded. Every person who visited him was immediately detained and interrogated. His friends stopped calling. His allies vanished. He was a prisoner living in the open air. Stalin then began to rewrite reality. In Moscow, Zhukov's name was systematically scrubbed from the official history books. Films commissioned to celebrate the fall of Berlin were aggressively re-edited. In the new movies, Stalin was depicted standing in a map room, brilliantly directing the entire war single-handedly. Zhukov was nowhere to be seen. Stalin even pushed the knife deeper. In 1948, he transferred Zhukov from Odessa to the Ural military district, a freezing, desolate command post in the middle of nowhere. Zhukov suffered a heart attack. He lay in bed, clutching his chest, waiting every night for the screech of tires outside his window and the knock on the door that meant the executioners had finally arrived. He was being erased. He was becoming a ghost with medals. The return of the eagle. But Stalin made one fundamental, fatal miscalculation. He believed that if he controlled the paperwork, he controlled the truth. On March 5, 1953, the Iron Tsar died. He suffered a massive stroke and collapsed on the floor of his dacha. The vacuum he left behind was terrifying. The inner circle immediately turned on each other like starving dogs. Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD, now transitioning into the MVD KGB structure, moved with lethal speed. He mobilized his internal secret police troops, preparing to seize absolute control of the Soviet state. He was hours away from crowning himself the new dictator. The rest of the Politburo, led by Nikita Khrushchev, panicked. They knew Beria would slaughter them all. They realized that to stop the secret police, they needed the raw, physical power of the Red Army. But the army wouldn't move for bureaucrats. They would only move for a god of war. Khrushchev sent an urgent, secret transport to the Ural Mountains. In the dead of night, Georgy Zhukov was brought back to Moscow. After 7 years of exile, humiliation, and terror, the eagle had returned. On June 26, 1953, the bill for the betrayal finally came due. During a high-level meeting of the Presidium in the Kremlin, Khrushchev gave a pre-arranged, desperate signal. The heavy wooden doors flew open. Zhukov marched into the room, flanked by heavily armed, combat-hardened generals. He didn't look at Khrushchev. He walked directly up to Lavrentiy Beria, the man who had tortured his friends, the man who had fabricated the evidence against him, the man who had orchestrated his exile. Zhukov didn't read a warrant. He didn't cite a legal code. He grabbed Beria by the arms with a visceral, violent force. "Hands up, Lavrentiy," Zhukov roared. "You are under arrest." Beria, the master of the Gulag, the man who had ordered the deaths of millions, instantly shattered. He collapsed into his chair, weeping and begging for mercy. Zhukov looked down at him with absolute freezing disgust. "Take him away," Zhukov ordered the guards. Beria was dragged to a military bunker, tied to a post, and shot directly in the forehead. The army had finally settled its score with the secret police, and Zhukov had delivered the bullet. The second betrayal. Zhukov's return to power was a blazing, triumphant sunset. He was named Minister of Defense. He modernized the Soviet military. He was, once again, the most beloved man in the nation. But if there is one brutal, unavoidable truth about totalitarian systems, it is this: the system cannot tolerate a hero. Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had begged Zhukov to save his life in 1953, eventually looked at the Marshal and felt the exact same bone-deep terror that Stalin had felt. Khrushchev saw the way the soldiers looked at Zhukov. He saw the popularity. He saw the threat. In 1957, while Zhukov was out of the country on a diplomatic trip to Yugoslavia, Khrushchev struck. He orchestrated a second, swift political coup against the Marshal. When Zhukov stepped off his plane in Moscow, he was met with the exact same betrayal he had faced a decade earlier. He was accused of Bonapartism. He was accused of trying to diminish the role of the Communist Party in the military. He was stripped of his titles. He was forced into a final, permanent retirement. Georgy Zhukov spent the last 17 years of his life confined to his dacha. He fought a bitter, agonizing war against government censors to publish his memoirs, fighting desperately to ensure the truth of the war wasn't erased by politicians. He died in 1974. He was buried with full military honors in the Kremlin wall, but only because a dead hero is a safe hero. The philosophical legacy of Zhukov's life is a devastating indictment of absolute power. A dictatorship is a machine that survives by eating its own children. It demands that men bleed to save it, and then it punishes them for being brave enough to do so. Stalin and Khrushchev exiled Zhukov because they knew a terrifying truth. The Soviet state was built on lies, but Zhukov's victory was built on blood, steel, and reality. They could order the history books rewritten. They could send him to the furthest corners of the earth. They could tap his phones and silence his friends. But they could never erase the fact that when the world was burning and the gates of Moscow were about to fall, the politicians hid in their bunkers. It was the man on the white horse who rode into the fire and pulled them out. And for that absolute, undeniable truth, they never forgave him.